Hello friends and welcome back. In this video we'll talk about the difference between prose and poetry. I will try to understand what is prose actually and how is it different from poetry. Okay. See, all writings are meant to communicate some message or messages to an audience. We know that. We write because we want to communicate some message to public, right? But the way or ways in which the message is communicated are different. There are different ways, styles of writing, and through those writings we try to communicate messages to the public. The basic classification of literature, the most basic classification of literature is prose and poetry. Any piece of literature can be classified as a poetic piece or prose piece. This can be done. Okay, so this is the most basic classification of literature. And what is the basic difference between prose and poetry? See, the most basic difference between prose and poetry, as stated by William Wordsworth, is poetry has the meter and prose does not have the meter. What is meter? Meter is the length of a line or of the lines. That is called meter. If you want to know about the poetry and the styles of poem and what is meter and how are these meters counted and calculated, then I'd suggest you to go back to the videos on practical criticism and try to have a look at them. I'll also provide the link of those videos in the description box. Let's continue with our video. See, some of the differentiating characteristics of prose and poetry can be listed as. Let us first of all try to understand the characteristics of prose. Prose is a very common form of writing. I'm saying that it is a very common form of writing because generally, people write in the language of prose. Most of their writings are done in prose. I mean, most of the people write most of the things in the language of prose. The language of prose is often straightforward and goes very close to the natural language of the people. It is very close to the language that people use every day, the language of prose. Okay. Ideas in prose writing are contained in sentences. This has to be remembered. Ideas in prose writings are contained in sentences. We have sentences when we write. We don't write in lines as we write in poetry. Prose is written in paragraphs. If you look at a chunk of a prose writing, you will find sentences and then paragraphs. So prose is written in paragraphs. There are no line breaks in prose. You will not find any line break in prose. Prose sentences run to the straight margin. You can see that every prose sentence goes to the end of the margin. It runs to the right margin. It begins from the left margin and reaches the right margin. The first word of each prose sentence is capitalized. This is a rule. The first word of each prose sentence is capitalized. Prose looks like large blocks of words. What does prose look like? It looks like large blocks of words. Then you will also see that there is no complex arrangement of words in prose. Prose does not pay attention to rhyme and rhythm. It may pay, but normally it doesn't pay any attention to rhyme and rhythm, and there is no importance given to sound effect in prose. You will find that there is no importance given to the sound effect in prose, and the basic intention of writing prose is to make people read, while the basic intention of writing poetry is to make people recite. We also have to see this difference, or to have this difference in our mind. Let us talk about the poetry now. See, poetry is not as common form of writing as prose is. We've seen that prose is a very common form of writing, but poetry is not as common form of writing as prose is. Everybody does not write in the language of poetry. Some people may write in the language of poetry, but not everybody, not most of the people. They do not write in the language of poetry because it requires some sort of skill. Poetry is reserved for expressing something in an artistic way. We reserve language of poetry to express something in an artistic way, a creative way. The language of poetry is often decorated. The language of poetry is often decorated. It's not a plain, simple language like prose. It's a decorated language. There are comparisons, rhyme, and rhythm in poetry. You can find there are plenty of comparisons. There is rhyme and rhythm in the language of poetry. Unlike prose, as it is written in paragraphs, poetry is written in stanzas. There are stanzas of the poem. There are often line breaks in poetry. Lines break in poetry. Ideas in poetry are contained in lines that may or may not be sentences. It is not necessary that lines of poetry may be the sentences. That may be the sentences, but not necessarily they are the sentences. The line of a poem or lines of the poem can be very long or as short as one word or one letter. Traditionally, the first letter of every line is capitalized. This is again a rule, but this rule is not followed by the modern writers. Some of the modern poets choose not to follow this rule strictly. Lines of poetry are arranged in stanzas. There are stanzas in poetry. There is often complex arrangement of words in poetry which is not seen in the language of prose. See, I'm using the word often because there are no watertight compartments to say that this is poetry and that is prose, because sometimes many poetic writings look like the writings in prose, and sometimes the prose writings look like the writings in poetry. So it is very difficult for us to find out the watertight compartments to say that these are the characteristics of prose and these are not the characteristics of prose. Anyways, in poetry, rhyme and rhythm is often given importance because poetry is meant to be recited, and great importance is given to sound effect in the language of poetry, because poetry is generally meant to be recited. As it is meant to be recited, the writers or the poets give great importance to the sound effects also. This we have to remember. I hope you have understood the basic difference between prose and poetry in general and what is prose in particular. In the next video, we're going to talk about prose fiction and non-fictional prose. If you have understood this video and liked it, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for the channel if you are new to it. Thank you very much for watching.